Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at the topic of schizoid solitude and whether schizoids really do prefer to be alone. I think it's important to cover this topic. I'm currently doing a series on Masterson's 5 subtypes of schizoid personality, and the next subtype will be the Pseudo-Borderline. However, before I go on to that topic, it's important to make it clear the relationship between schizoids and solitude. So we'll go on. The idea of schizoids preferring solitude is quite prolific when you look online at different information about what schizoid personality entails. I think that this idea has come from the DSM-5 criteria, not just the DSM-5, maybe some of the previous DSMs as well, but it currently says that schizoids almost always choose solitary activities. Although this is true for some schizoid individuals, this criteria doesn't cover the entire inner subjective experience. And I'll go on to explain some of the reasons why this could be misleading. It reinforces the stereotype that schizoid individuals inherently want solitude, rather than viewing it as a coping mechanism or a defensive adaptation. I'll go through the 3 main points related to this now. Neither desires or enjoys close relationships. This suggests that all schizoid individuals lack social desire, when in reality some may secretly wish for connection but be incapable of engaging in relationships safely. The next point, almost always chooses solitary activities. This presents solitude as an active preference rather than a defense mechanism against perceived emotional overwhelm or interpersonal disappointment. Appears indifferent and shows emotional coldness. These phrases focus on outward behavior but don't acknowledge that many schizoids experience deep emotional sensitivity internally. The missing perspective is that when we look at it from a psychoanalytic perspective, this suggests that many schizoid individuals withdraw not because they want to, but because relationships feel unsafe, overwhelming, or intrusive. And so the DSM symptom-based approach doesn't account for these internal conflicts. In a nutshell, I think that the DSM criteria has contributed to a warped perception of schizoid individuals and also our relationship with solitude. When we look at the Guntrip criteria, what we see is that loneliness is recognized as a schizoid trait. However, preference for solitude is not. Here we have the spectrum of schizoid interpersonal engagement. And this shows that the desire for relationships and emotional connection differs from person to person. So there are some schizoids that have no desire for relationships, some schizoids are in and out of relationships, and some schizoids who are actually in married and committed relationships. What we see from this spectrum straight away is that there are some schizoids who choose to live a life that involves other people. So this is already contradicting the schizoid preference for solitude. I added in this spectrum to show that it varies from person to person, the degree to which they're able to tolerate people, the degree to which they're interested in interacting with people. The core underlying similarity in schizoids goes back to the Guntrip criteria that I showed earlier and having withdrawal as their main defense mechanism. Another spectrum that I think really highlights the relationship with solitude is the schizoid solitude spectrum. I've created this spectrum to really home in on the various relationships with solitude that schizoids can have. What this spectrum is here to represent is how a person's relationship with solitude can vary. I think in answering the question of whether schizoids really prefer solitude and if they really just want to be alone, it's important to look at the master slave unit in the Masterson approach. I did make a whole video, actually 2 videos, about the master slave quadrant. I went into a lot of detail about it, but I'll link the main one in the description below. For now, I'm primarily going to just focus on the exile because this is most relevant to answering our question. Masterson highlighted the self in exile as a phase of schizoid social withdrawal from relational dynamics rather than a main preference for solitude. He sees schizoids as going through different cycles of engaging and withdrawal, and this is linked to the schizoid dilemma between wanting to be close but also to maintain emotional distance. The way that he looked at schizoids being alone was as follows. I've listed the key points. The key insight is that the self in exile is a defensive response to overwhelming, intrusive, or emotionally unsafe relational dynamics rather than a lifelong preference. I'm in agreement with the changeability of an individual's relationship to solitude depending on where they're at in their life. If we go back to the spectrum here, I do think that people can move from different positions, as I said, depending on what they're going through in their life or their psychological state at the time. However, I do think that people tend to sometimes spend long periods of time in either one state or the other. However, I do also think that individuals have the propensity to spend long periods of time in either one state or the other. Next, I want to talk about the impact of hyperpermeability on a schizoid's preference for solitude. Hyperpermeability is excessive openness to external stimuli, emotions, and interpersonal dynamics. In schizoid individuals, this heightened sensitivity often results in emotional overwhelm and difficulty maintaining relational boundaries. The key insight is that understanding hyperpermeability challenges the assumption that schizoid solitude is purely voluntary, showing that for many, withdrawal is a survival mechanism rather than a true lifestyle choice. Although it's important to include hyperpermeability, it's not talked about a lot, and it's something that does affect schizoids that we can really take on other people's energies and social interactions, and it can lead to us processing and ruminating about the social interactions after the event has taken place. We need to come back to ourselves after being around other people because we can be so impacted by the energy of other people. And I think this is a major contributing factor to why schizoids may prefer to be alone. And this isn't coming from a place of like internal sort of desire, but more from a place of necessity. The impact of commonality on preference for solitude. Schizoid cognition. Schizoid individuals often engage in abstract, introspective, or highly individualized thinking, which can create a sense of cognitive and emotional distance from others. It can be difficult for them to relate to social norms. Many schizoids report feeling out of sync with conventional social norms, small talk, or collective interests, making social engagement feel unfulfilling or pointless. Due to their preference for internal mental landscapes, schizoids may prioritize personal interests, philosophy, or creative pursuits over relational bonding, further reinforcing solitude. Even when engaging in social interactions, schizoids may struggle to find shared interests or emotional resonance with others, leading to a sense of alienation. Solitude as a default, not always a choice. Rather than an explicit rejection of people, the lack of commonality in thought, emotion, or interest often results in schizoids feeling more at home in solitude. Key insight being, for many schizoids, social withdrawal is not solely about avoiding connection, but about the absence of meaningful, engaging, or stimulating interactions. It's pretty self-explanatory. The impact of social anhedonia on preference for solitude. This is an important one because it's really going to make a difference on how someone feels or their attitude towards socializing. Social anhedonia is a reduced ability to experience pleasure from social interactions. Unlike social anxiety, which stems from fear or avoidance, which is defensive, social anhedonia reflects a genuine lack of enjoyment in social settings. Many schizoids feel detached or neutral in social situations. Relationships do not provide the fulfillment in the way they do for others, leading to low motivation to engage socially. Unlike hyperpermeability, which leads to withdrawal due to overstimulation, social anhedonia leads to disengagement due to lack of reward. For many schizoids, relationships feel pointless or unfulfilling, making solitude a default state rather than a defense mechanism, though it can be argued that the social anhedonia originates from a defense mechanism. However, if the person isn't conscious of any trauma or anything having gone wrong, they might not attribute their lack of desire to defenses, as they may not feel in any way defensive about socializing, just have a lack of interest. On to the next. Schizoids can form relationships but often find solitude more satisfying or neutral. The absence of social pleasure does not equate to an inability to bond, but rather a reduced intrinsic motivation for interpersonal closeness. And finally, alternative sources of engagement. Instead of socializing, some schizoids turn to intellectual, creative, or fantasy-based pursuits, as we've talked about earlier in the video. And this reinforces self-sufficiency, making their internal worlds more engaging than interpersonal relationships. So part of the joy towards solitude is that we have much more interesting things going on in our own mind and what we're doing within our own lives than we are going to have by interacting with other people. Yeah. Key insight. Understanding social anhedonia challenges the idea that schizoid solitude is purely defensive, highlighting that for many, withdrawal is a natural consequence of low social reward rather than a reaction to emotional overwhelm. So it's possible that some people, because of lack of reward from socializing, just don't want to socialize and they just like being on their own and they prefer solitude. That's another perspective. Then we come to the end. Not yet, not yet, not yet. Okay, so to sum up the question, do schizoids really prefer solitude? I think the answer to that is yes and no. That means that there are some that genuinely prefer solitude and are happy with that. And then there are others who feel forced to stay alone. So, on to 5 key takeaways about the schizoid solitude preference. 1. The DSM oversimplifies the schizoid experience by ignoring inner conflicts. 2. Desire for solitude exists on a spectrum, not as an absolute state. 3. Schizoid withdrawal is often defensive rather than a voluntary or true preference for solitude. 4. Cognitive and emotional misalignment with others can influence the decisions for solitude. And 5. Schizoids may lack motivation for relationships without consciously feeling lonely. One or the other. Final thought. Schizoid solitude is often misunderstood as voluntary detachment, but for many, it is a result of emotional overwhelm, social disinterest, and cognitive isolation, rather than a simple desire to be alone. In summary, preference for solitude is not necessarily a schizoid trait, though many schizoids may develop a preference for solitude for various different reasons. I had to make this point clear, otherwise the pseudo-borderline video would not make sense to certain people who believe that all schizoids have a preference for solitude, because as we can see, this is not necessarily the case. So I hope I made this point clear, and I will be back soon with the pseudo-borderline video.